Alright guys, in this section we're going to talk about functions. We have already talked about functions a lot and we have used it all over the place. So I don't think I have to go in the details and define what a function is, as that would be pedantic and a waste of time. Instead, for the sake of completeness, let's just say it is a reusable piece of code and move on. But what we should focus on is how are functions used in Solidity and Solidity specific details. Alright, so in Solidity, this is the notation for a function. So you have this function call, you have a parameter that needs to be passed into a function, like may or may not be passed into a function like every other language out there. Then you have this visibility modifiers that are internal, external, public, or private. Then you have this restriction modifiers, which could be pure, view, or payable. Then there is this thing called custom modifiers. This we will not cover this chapter, but we'll cover later. And then you obviously have to have returns statement to actually say what the function is returning. This is also very Solidity specific. So we're going to go over each of these in details and discuss about it. So the very first thing is parameters, right? So in every other language, you pass in parameters. However, Solidity is a type language. So in Solidity, you actually have to declare the type of the parameter that you're going to pass. So if we go to our old example, like this one, this is subtract 1, but if we actually wanted to subtract a number, so you would have to pass in, we actually have to specify this unsigned integer here and say like this parameter type is actually an unsigned integer. Now going back, that is not the only thing about the parameters though. Let's say we were doing something else. Let's say we need a function that needs array. So in this case, the parameter would be an array and it should be numbers. In this case, we know from our previous chapter that we actually have to pass in data location. It could be memory, or storage, or call data, depending on the function itself. Let's move on to this visibility modifiers. So the visibility modifiers can be public, private, external, or internal. This is the second thing that we have in our function notation. And what are the difference between the four? We already know quite a bit, so let's just go over one more time just so discuss about it for the sake of completeness. Public. Whenever we say public, this means a function is visible externally and internally. And if we call public on a state variable, it actually creates a getter function automatically for us. So this is what I'm talking about. When we said public on count, it actually created a getter function for count that we did not have to write out ourselves. Okay, next thing is private. When we make a function private, it is only visible to the current contract. It's not even visible to the contracts that are inheriting it. We'll talk about inheritance later. We can also make the functions external. When it's visible externally, it is different from public because the public is open to everyone. People can call it from both inside and outside. But when you make a function external, it can only be called from outside. And then there is internal. This is only visible internally, which means the contract itself and anything that's inheriting from the contract can actually call that function. So in the scale of most restrictive to least restrictive, this is how it goes. Private, which is most restricted, then there is internal, then there is external and public. So now that brings up the question, why don't we just make everything public and get it over? Well, it's not a good idea. For the sake of security, it's better to use the most restrictive function for the job. And also I would argue that for the readability purpose, if you actually use these things extensively, it actually tells you easily by looking at the functions where and how they're used. So the three of these four modifiers actually also can be used on variables, on state variables, except external, because external doesn't really make sense if it's not a function. So that's it for visibility modifiers. Let's now look at restriction modifiers. The restriction modifiers can be pure, view, and payable. A function that is restricted to pure cannot modify a state data, neither can it read from it. A function that is restricted to view can actually read from the state data. We have already used this in details before, so there is no point in going over in too much details. Underneath the hood, this pure and view functions actually call something called eth_call function from the JSON RPC. That's the API that we use to talk to Ethereum EVM. If we don't use this pure and view, then the function can actually change the state, and for that, underneath the hood, we actually call JSON RPC's eth_send transaction function. So just to remind you, this is what I mean by pure and view and all that. And then there is this payable modifier, which when added, a function can actually receive ether. In Remix, if we see a function payable, it will actually show up as red instead of just blue and orange. This that we see here. It'll actually show up as right here. I don't have an example now, but we'll come across this example. Another thing to note is that we always have to return something, and we actually have to say what we're returning. Return says we're returning something and what kind of variable we're returning. If it is like a pass by reference type of variable, like unsigned integer array, then we actually also have to specify the data location along with it, like so. And this is a trivial example. I mean, obviously this function would be different if we're returning that. That's all I have on functions. See you in the next chapter.